And am I correct in remembering each speaker has 20 minutes?
15 to 20 minutes, yes. That's,
15 to 20. Yeah.
we had 5 speakers at times, and really it took 2 hours for all of us. But this is a cozy kind of panel. And Amita, has she joined already? Is she there?
I saw her earlier.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes.
I'm here.
Hi, hello, lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too.
Wait, let me just, and Austin, is Austin there?
I am indeed. Hello.
Hello, Austin. So lovely to see you.
It's really nice to see you too.
Excellent. So let me just get my notes. And
Nova Scotia, Oxford, so many people.
Great, 8 o'clock, wonderful. Hello, welcome. My name is Esther Schmidt. I'm the director of the Center for Historic Houses. I'm very, very excited to have you all, and I would like to extend a warm welcome. Please use the chat option for any comments or questions. We'll wait with the questions towards the end of all the lectures. Perhaps you can write a queue in front of your questions so that it's easier to spot and differentiate from the comments. And we really like to have it as a very interactive session. So please, send a note from telling us from where you are, watching us. Especially during the pandemic, I think these events are wonderful opportunities to engage with colleagues, learn new things, and meet new friends. So please, participate. Thank you very much. So today is day 5. The conservation panel of our lecture series, Great Minds in Heritage and Historic Houses, and it is the last day of our Heritage Week, which has been very exciting for all of us. Now, the reason behind the title, Great Minds in Heritage and Historic Houses, is that the historic houses themselves and those who care for them are meant to be the focal point of our discussion. In our lecture series, we have invited people who've made important contributions in thinking and writing about or caring for historic houses, their collections, and the people associated with them. Others have been active in ensuring their existence through concrete efforts of conservation, management, interpretation, and reinterpretation, or through new design efforts or adaptive reuse. Their work, our work, is meaningful, but also because of how communities are affected by these initiatives. In many conversations with owners of historic houses, the concept of community and the relevance has fundamentally changed during the pandemic. And one example is today's event. So we have so many speakers and people in the audience from many different corners of the world, and that is fabulous. That's something we really want to encourage at the Center for Historic Houses, to build bridges. The Heritage Week has been guided by these aspects, connected with historic houses, and I divided the event into 4 panels: curation, education, heritage management, and conservation. All of these lectures are available on our YouTube channel, and perhaps someone can mention the link in the chat box, the Center for Historic Houses YouTube channel. At times, the underlying principles, motivations, and discourses of these various stakeholders can be at odds with each other, and priorities can differ. I believe that it is important to listen to the various groups and to engage in discussions rather than to impose our own views or set of priorities. Recent debates and events, from the pandemic to political events, have caused us all to rethink our roles and the purpose and contributions of the historic houses or the other institutions we are associated with, and to what extent we need to rediscover or possibly revise some of the original ideas. In the context of curation, for example, we looked at some museum practices that were established in the 19th century. For instance, it always occurs, I'm surprised that when I want to see Indian art, I suddenly have to go to the Islamic art collection when I want to see Mughal art. All of these things are well established in the past, but our scholarship has moved forward. So how do we deal with all of these things? Historic houses have multiple histories and layers of meaning, and it remains a challenge to consider all of them. I'm personally very excited about the idea of knowledge transfer between the various stakeholders and exchange between different countries or even continents, and to learn from each other. Our Center for Historic Houses, established in 2019 with a conference on water and heritage, and we are very inspired, and we work together with ICOMOS Netherlands. It's very young, and we are at the very beginning of our work. We are delighted about the warm welcome, the great interest and support from our colleagues, partners, and the audience. This week has been a fantastic learning experience, and I would like to thank all of you who contributed, especially our speakers tonight, and also our interns from the University of Oxford, who've been working tirelessly behind the scenes and have done fabulous work. Many well-known institutions, including the world's most visited museum, the Louvre, has participated in our program, to the world's largest museum, the Smithsonian, with over 19 museums. Yet there were so many new things we learned in this week. For instance, the little-known Asian art collection at the Louvre. I'd like to conclude with some observations from this week. Now, I've seen fantastic and inspiring examples of historic houses that both honored the original owners and made the content and the collection of the houses relevant with contemporary exhibitions, such as Hillwood Estate, but also the Frick collection. I also want to mention Darren Milligan from the Smithsonian Learning Lab. He said, how can we help young people to be successful in their lives? And I think that we are able, with our work, the conservation, preservation, engagement with historic houses, can lead to another person being successful in his life or her life. That is wonderful. And this goes beyond the only conservation issues. So I'm really, really pleased now to welcome our first speaker, Rob Woodside from English Heritage. And he is responsible for over 420 properties, which sounds like an unsurmountable task really at English Heritage, from Stonehenge to Osborne House, that I personally really like very much. Rob, welcome, and thank you very much for being here today. And it's so exciting to hear your direct insights and experience from your work with all of these very, very different monuments.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen, if I may. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
we're up and running. Okay, good afternoon or good evening, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rob Woodside. I'm the Conservation Estates Director at English Heritage. What I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about our overall philosophy towards conservation. Managing such a large, diverse and complex estate across the country is hugely challenging, as well as incredibly enriching. And I want to talk through some of the approaches we've been taking the last couple of years, which are shaping our approach to conservation of our built environment. If you don't know English Heritage, we are now a charity. We used to be part of a government body, and we were split out from government in 2015. And we're responsible for what we call the National Heritage Collection, which is, as you see here, a huge number of prehistoric sites, Roman sites, ecclesiastical, historic houses, castles, everything from some of the grandest buildings in England to some exceptional oddities like Cold War bunkers and individual standing stones. And we also run the Blue Plaque Scheme in London, where we celebrate notable people from history. So our overall objective as a charity is to bring history to life. It's to tell great stories, to really engage people in the past, and sort of explore the depth of England's history. And we do that for a number of ways. But one of the ways that the area I'm responsible for is to ensure that our properties are well maintained, safe, accessible, sustainable, and have a long-term future. Just again, bit of insight, bit of background to the organisation. Some of our properties, being mentioned Stonehenge, of course, which is our flagship organisation. Everyone in the world knows Stonehenge. But we've also got a number of historic houses like Rest Park, you see in the centre there, which is a 19th century house in the French style with a capability brown landscape. The most wonderful Elizabethan property at Audley End. Dover Castle, one of the earliest castles and one of the first concentric walled castles in Europe. Osborne House, which is, Mary tells me, was one of her favourites, which is a wonderful property with the exceptional Durbar room, which shows the interaction between Indian architects in a British environment, creating something fabulous for Queen Victoria. And large lengths of Hadrian's Wall. So it's a very large, diverse set of property, from historic houses to ancient monuments. Since we became a charity in 2015, we've been hard at work addressing a lot of the conservation deficit across the whole estate. We've got, well, we estimated when we set up as a charity, something in the region of 50 to 60 million pounds worth of backlog and defects to address. We're lucky in receiving some government funding towards this as part of the setup of the charity. And since then, we've been beavering away trying to address all this. And you can see some of the examples of projects here. We've got Iron Bridge, which is the first iron-built bridge in the world, a World Heritage Site. We completed the conservation on that year before last, and last year were a winner in the Europa Nostra Awards for conservation, which we're very, very proud of. And which the product you can see here is having completed the work, we revealed the original paint color of the structure. For having been a sort of gunmetal gray for years, it's now this beautiful ox blood red, and it's caused dismay amongst the postcard sellers in Ironbridge, who had lovely pictures of grey bridges. Anyway, it's a wonderful building. And the centre here is, on the right hand side, is Rest Park, which is, this is the Archer Pavilion, part of the design landscape. Byland Abbey in the left hand corner is an example of some of the work that we've had to do, just stripping back years of debris and growth and deposition across our stone-built monuments, which can lead to a lot of deterioration and structural issues across the piece. And the chap here peeling back the turf like almost like a carpet just reveals some of the depth of the challenge we've got on site. And the bottom right-hand corner is Pevensey Castle down in southeast England, which includes some of the finest Roman walls north of the Alps, and a medieval castle. And we've just completed the 3-year project there to clear the site of invasive vegetation, consolidate the walls, reopen parts of the estate of the property, and welcome people back into it as well. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So all well and good, and we are on track to address an awful lot of our work, but this picture here, which is Hurst Castle out on the south coast of England, actually is an illustration of some of the real challenges we face as an organisation. Hurst Castle lies on the end of a spit. It was built originally by Henry VIII. The central part of the monument is clear from the circular tower, and was expanded again in the mid-19th century to create a defence leading in from the Solent into Portsmouth Harbour. So strategically extremely important site. And it's a huge site. It's an absolute monumental monolith when you're up close to it. But as you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, even seemingly robust buildings like this are in fact vulnerable. And this is an event that happened only 3 weeks ago. We'd completed a series of refreshed coastal defences across the front of the Western Battery last year. And we were just about to start work on the Eastern Battery when unfortunately wind, weather, storm events just stole a march on us, and we saw a substantial collapse in the building of about 38 meters of the castle, 19th century castle wall. And what this shows is just, I think it's a sort of illustration of the vulnerability that a lot of our properties actually face, and symbolic, I think, of the challenge we're still going to face in English heritage in looking after this estate of over 400 properties. And one of the reasons this is so challenging is because many of our historic buildings aren't working and functioning as historic buildings should do. They don't have roofs, they're empties, they're shells. So if you've got examples like Hardwick Old Hall, which is a 16th century mansion in Derbyshire, famous for its internal plasterwork and architectural details, has long suffered from stone degradation, plaster fall, and is generally in a deteriorating condition. Another example of that is Wheatley Court, which is the building that size now is the latest iteration, the 19th century. Again, roofless structure, very subject to stonefall and plaster loss. Sutton Starsdale, again up in the in Derbyshire, beautiful site in the Peak District, standing again as a very exposed empty shell. And some of our buildings simply haven't had roofs or structures to them at all. So very high status Roman villa in Gloucestershire on the bottom right hand side, excavated sometime the earlier 20th century, some covering over the most significant bits of the mosaics, but suffering from exposure, frost damage, and animal burrowing. So these are examples of some of the challenge we face because our buildings aren't occupied, they're not able to work in the way that buildings should in terms of protecting interiors, managing internal environments. And so we face a perpetual challenge in terms of their ongoing maintenance. And there's lots we have to face up to in English heritage. I mentioned backlog. There's certainly always, in an estate this size and complexity, lots of work to be done. There's stuff that maybe should have been done a long time ago, but time, resources, and the rest of it means that levels of maintenance can't be upheld to what we want. And it's probably fair to say that the estate, which has been in the care of the government for well over 100 years, has probably never had enough money spent on it. There's probably never been a time when it's been in ideal condition, and there's always a challenge with our kind of properties. So we are facing deterioration. Some of our buildings are just the nature of the stonework is very fragile and vulnerable, and it tends to deteriorate. And we're just starting a project in Lincoln to try and address that on a major site there. Water ingress, very common factor when you're dealing with large scale historic buildings. Vegetation growth, which is something particular to managing ruins and castles. And of course, exposure. For example, the Hurst Castle gives a good example of exposure because we're right on the waterfront. But actually, we've got buildings alongside riversides, on hilltops, in urban areas where different factors can impact on their conservation. And in that, of course, we have to focus on safety. We have to focus on fire risk, compliance, keep our properties safe. And of course, there is only so much resource we can put towards this, so much money, so much time, so many people. There's a skills gap, which actually limits the availability of people who can work on our properties. And increasingly, we're recognizing the challenge from climate change, which essentially is exacerbating a lot of the issues we're already facing. It's necessarily a new thing that will stand on its own, but it is going to drive a lot of the risks that we see even further. So some other examples of vulnerability. That's our key focus at the moment. How do we address vulnerability? How do we not just deal with repairs that we can see in front of us, but actually try and deal with the root causes of those those issues? So there's another picture of Hurst Castle. We're facing coastal erosion and how we manage the issues around maintaining not just structures, but civil engineering, groins, shingles, rock armouring. Centerpiece picture is Belse Hall in Northumberland, where the vulnerability comes from the design of the building itself. It's got internal water drainage and water goods, which means that if there's an issue with drainage and water can't be carried off the roof, it either causes an issue internally within the building or it causes an issue within the roof itself. And we've had long periods of water ingress and floods in that building, and which actually led to it being abandoned and led to it becoming in the hands of English Heritage in the first place. And I am glad to say we've got a major project starting this year which is going to address that. Some of our sites lie in the public realm. They're not like they're down the end of a drive. You know, there's security guards. This is a site on the top right-hand corner in Dover, which is Dover Western Heights. It's part of a Napoleonic defensive outpost, well away from the castle on the other side of the town, where the local kids like to hang out. And it's unstaffed. It's largely inaccessible, and so it hasn't had the sort of attention and focus of maintenance that it's really needed. Other places are just inherently vulnerable. The picture on the left-hand side is a 19th century Martello Tower, built again during the Napoleonic Wars to defend the coastline. The challenge we're facing there is not simply about addressing water ingress, but trying to meet the expectations of the volunteers and staff who work there, who say it's always damp, it's always wet. And I have to respond saying, yes, it always has been, because it was a temporary shelter thrown up. And those days, they didn't really care about the comfort of the soldiers based there. So that's the issue we're trying to fix. We're not necessarily trying to create a warm, comfy environment for a 21st century experience. And other properties like Kenwood House are vulnerable because of their location or because of the nature of the collections, which are highly significant. So we have issues regarding security and access. And I've mentioned Sutton Sarsdale already, sort of the open, exposed, roofless monuments, which just asking for bits to fall off them. So how do we address this? How do we manage the priorities as English Heritage? What mechanism have we got to target our greatest need and deal with our greatest liabilities? Because that's essentially what we're trying to do here. We're trying to reduce risk, reduce vulnerability, and we're trying to build the resilience of the whole estate. And we can't do everything everywhere. The level of deficit outstrips availability of funding, people to do it. We've got a number of challenges. So what we've done over the last few years is taken a much more structured approach, and we're looking at our properties much more in terms of their significance, which has always been a primary objective of English Heritage, to understand our historic buildings, their history, the fabric, and the societal and aesthetic values to them, but be able to try and pinpoint that significance much more clearly. We really target in terms of what matters about our site and where does it matter most. We're then able to overlay that with our understanding of condition. So what state is it in? Where are the issues we can record? And then what are the causes of it? What is actually making this site vulnerable? What is actually driving the deterioration or the change or what we're seeing in front of us? What can we actively do about it? And what we've done is we've scored each of our properties. We've looked at everyone in the country. We've ranked them in terms of their significance. We've ranked them in terms of vulnerability and condition. So the higher the number for significance, the more significant it is. The higher number for vulnerability, it's greater how exposed it is to vulnerability. And condition also relates to its known state. So a low number would say actually that's in good condition, and a high number saying it's in poor condition. And then what we're able to do is to compile a set of scores, and it's not a science, it's an indicative process, and it's based on the professional judgment of our curators and our building surveyors and other professionals working in English Heritage to try and get a sense of where do these sites fall. And then what we're able to do is to rank them in terms of order and give ourselves satisfaction that actually some of our sites, although they might have defects, they might be carrying backlog, we know they're actually manageable. We know they're going to be in a condition we can hold. Other places, the ones in red, are where we're really seeing the issues and where we have to prioritize our resources. And then what we can do is use this to try and track our performance to say, okay, how many of our properties are vulnerable? How many of our properties are meeting the condition that's required? So that way we can actually be more confident in terms of where we put our resources. And when we've done that, we can make decisions about our approach, our conservation philosophy. Now, most of that is going to be like for like repair. It's the nature of our properties means that we're limited in terms of what we can do with them. They're full of extraordinarily rich historic fabric, and our approach needs to be very informed, sensitive, and we can undertake light touch repairs to retain their significance and character. But in some cases, we might have to do more. We have to go further than that. We have to think about intervention and increasingly having to think about adaptation as well when we consider the impacts of climate change. In some cases, we need to think about new uses. What else can we do with a building? If the best purpose of a building is to have an active use, what can we do in that structure that's going to help us maintain and sustain it for the future and create new opportunities? And in some extreme cases and unusual cases, we may have to think about managed curated decline, where we've explored all options and we're not able to actually do anything to sustain a structure or parts of that building in the long term. And we might have to make some difficult decisions about it. Now, to help us, we've created something we've called Conservation Framework. It's essentially a conservation management plan, but what we've done is really targeted and boiled down the essence of what a conservation management plan needs to do to look at where it really matters and how we prioritize our work. So in this case, this is Dover Castle, one of our largest and most complex sites. And we've able to say, right, okay, where's the greatest significance? And if you see deterioration, where's it going to matter most? So we've used...
A Paula, quando eu lhe pedi, eu mandei-lhe um e-mail, foi mesmo comigo que falou.
Hello.
Nós temos já um kit de início. Este kit aqui de início é a tal primeira encomenda, está bem?
Can you just please unmute the attendant?
Exatamente, mas vamos ter que fazer a primeira encomenda. Se quiser utilizar os produtos, use.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're trying. We can target our work more effectively, and what we're doing now is we've used this as the basis of a new conservation project, which will start this year, which is targeting the most significant, the most vulnerable parts of the property, knowing from what we do about the condition, what we know about vulnerability and risk, that we are addressing enough to get our properties in what we call sustainable condition. Elsewhere, I've mentioned Hardwick Old Hall. We have to think about interventions. It's had such there's almost the building itself is almost a lesson in conservation practice. It has been, there's so many interventions already gone into the structure, yet we still keep on coming back and back again to the same problems about water ingress, about plasterfall, about having to repair structures, that actually we need to make a bigger step. We have to do something else here. Otherwise, we're just going to keep on coming back and pouring more and more money into this place. So the options are maybe putting on a roof over the most significant part of the building. It's high cost intervention. Or maybe, as you see on the right-hand corner, more light touch interventions. So cover shelters, which are actually going to take the water away from the walls and to protect the most vulnerable aspects, including the plaster work you can see above you. So we can try and manage water more effectively rather than having to come back and repeat the repairs year in, year out. And we are thinking about new uses. This is Bristol Temple Church. It's a ruined medieval structure in the middle of Bristol in an urban area, which hasn't been open to the public for years. The conditions not being good enough, it's not being safe. We're now going to run a new project to reopen it to the public. But in part of that, we have to think about, what do we do with this site? It lies in the heart of an urban area. And if we do nothing, then we'll go back to where we were before, which is easily overlooked, risk of antisocial behavior. So what we're exploring at the moment with partners in Bristol is potentially turning it into some either communal garden, or even, as you can see in front of you, some sort of performance space with a roof over the top that's going to serve the local community as well as the artistic community in Bristol. And this is back to Hurst Castle again. The challenge we have, and we're going to increasingly face, is one from climate change, particularly on coastal areas, particularly in the areas of vulnerable properties. And so much of what we need to do is now focusing our areas of understanding, of vulnerability, of risk, thinking about how this is going to change our approach to maintenance, and how we cope with this sort of extreme event. And this is, again, a sort of question of how far can we take conservation and defense of properties in the light of what could be, over the next 50 years, up to a meter of sea level rise in this part of the coastline. It's a huge challenge. You know, we have to make some very big decisions about this site, which we don't have the answers to yet. But what we are trying to drive towards is what we call sustainable condition. There's a sort of as close as definition I can get to it. And it's about how we're addressing the most significant of parts of our properties. So are we getting them into fair and good condition? And we can score that and rank that through our matrix. Are we addressing the key risks to safety? So masonry fall, fire risk, all the rest of it, all the things that we have to think of in terms of safe and sustainable access to the property. Are we addressing vulnerability? In some cases we can, in some cases we will never be able to completely eradicate the vulnerability, but actually some ways, some easy wins could be, as described in terms of hard overhaul, some sort of interventions in some of our roofless properties as well. And we just try and avoid the repeated expenditure of repair because we've actually addressed the problem, which is basically water ingress. And we're looking to see how we ensure our planned cyclical maintenance regimes are absolutely fit for purpose. So they follow through this philosophy. They're looking at all the needs of the properties. And then if we have any conservation defect or deficit, we can still continue to address it, but we'll do it through routine maintenance. It won't be through having to do more expensive projects, more cost-hungry, time-hungry work that we risk having to repeat in the future. We have to make sure that our maintenance regime, which is absolutely the heart of all this, in the best way we can. This is expanding our approach. We're having to think very carefully about it all, and we're having to address different areas of work to really make this happen. So we're thinking much more about research. So how do we really understand vulnerability? Who can we work with to help develop the right research questions to do that? And I'm glad to say we've just begun an engagement fellowship with Oxford University through the Resilient Buildings and Landscapes group to start shaping some of those questions. Technology and digital has a large part to play in this as well. We already work closely with Historic England in terms of geospatial and mapping and collecting the data on our properties, but we're using AI technology at Kenwood House to help us better understand how the building performs and how we can address issues like energy management, environmental management, risk issues through better understanding of use of data. And we're doing that in partnership with Ecclesiastical Insurance. We need our properties to become more environmentally sustainable. We have a responsibility as a charity to minimize our own footprint on the world. So we're looking to see how we can address energy reduction across our top 10 heaviest using properties. When I found out that 60% of all our energy use came down to 10 properties, it was a real sort of light bulb moment, and it was a real sense of, right, okay, it's very clear what we have to do here. We know there are 10 properties which we can make a real difference in terms of our energy use. And beyond conservation, thinking about our overall practice in terms of our visitors, our commercial outlets, our catering, our waste management, our use of vehicles. How do we become a more sustainable organization and work towards becoming carbon zero? And the final area of our strategy, really thinking about what we want to support the sector in the future, is thinking about skills training. Skills are so critical to caring for historic houses and historic buildings and monuments. And there are definitely gaps within the UK construction market. There are challenges in terms of getting apprenticeships up and running. There needs to be a step change in how we do that in the UK, and I hope that English Heritage can play a part in creating that. And we have, I hope, the best properties to learn from, but the structures in terms of our apprenticeships are run at the moment just don't know what we need to do. So we're challenging that. And we can't do it on our own. This is a big challenge. This is some of the issues we're dealing with, issues that organizations all around the world are having to face. And I'm really glad that we're starting to build up some great working relationships with government bodies, academics, commercial sector, groups in the UK and internationally to help us bring our thinking together, bring their expertise, bring their knowledge, but also for us to share what we do as well. We're very much treating our work in conservation with open arms. We want to be able to engage with different partners. We want to be able to learn from others and share what we do as well in supporting our global efforts for good conservation and sustainable development. And I want to leave you with my absolute favorite slide, courtesy of the Archaeological Survey of India. Sustain your heritage and feel glorious. Who wouldn't want to do that? So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Fantastic, Rob. Thank you so much. Extremely insightful, lots of difficult questions. Of course, I'd really love to talk to you about the Water and Heritage Network. I think that's something you would find very interesting from ICOMOS Netherlands as well at a later stage. Thanks so much. So talking about the ASI, now let's move over to India. Amita Baig, Executive Director of the World Monuments Fund India. I'm so pleased that you are here. I always say I've known you before I ever came to India, and I'm so delighted to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the Center of Historic Houses for this wonderful initiative, bringing all of us together. And I'm going to share my screen. Whoops, how do I do that?
See the green button? Share
Yep.
screen. Yeah.
There we are. So thank you so much. And as Mimi said, I am the Executive Director of World Monuments Fund in India. We've had a presence here for over 25 years, dealing with a wide range of things from forts and palaces to temples and Buddhist gompas. And but I have chosen at this time to talk to you about, oh gosh, how am I going to move this? Yes, about historic interiors and the challenges in India. I think there's a whole, it's a completely different narrative, because I think historic interiors tell the story. They tell the story of the erstwhile rulers and the influences of the time. They're much, in a way, much richer than just having a fortification to look at. And they reflect the many changes of power structures. And the India, as you know, was this whole slew of Maharajas or kings who ruled from their forts with all the related paraphernalia of armies and people. And in the 20th century, they made a transition, and it was a transition which was a defining one, because in a way it was a disempowerment, because outside their forts they were no longer ruling kings. They came into palaces and became beautiful men with beautiful homes, and it was a very skillful divestment of power. But as you can see, each one, whether it's Mehrangarh Fort or Stoke Palace, it's such a rich way of explaining how a building was. And there are a whole lot of unique sets of issues and a diverse range of issues. Here we have Saraswat Mahal in Tanjore, which is one of the finest and largest collections of classical Indian literature extant in India. And, you know, the issue here is as much climate change, as Rob was talking about earlier. It's about looking at contemporary ways of storage, whether you could use technology. But the problem is, in most of these, the protection agencies, whether it's the Archaeological Survey of India or the state departments, there's a lack of budget, lack of care. There's so much work to be done with the building that the interiorists tend to pay a price, and very often you get a sort of distortion of the interior. And, you know, it's hard to say how much of the Saraswat Mahal is the original. but one could equally say it's the overlays of centuries of culture, and that tells its own story. Or you have the much simpler ones like Padmanabhapuram Palace in South India, where the interior is so very simple. And because it's a partnership between the state and the traditional owners, it tends to work a lot better. One of the other challenges, I think, apart from climate change and sustainability, is not one of these buildings was designed for the kind of footfalls we see today. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about two historic buildings we're working on. So to try and showcase how we deal with the restoration of the building, but the problems we face or the challenges and opportunities that every building faces. The Osmania Women's College is a sort of early 19th century building. It's the former residency building so built very much in the classical colonial style. And it's also a statement of it then emerging British power, not quite in complete British power, but an emerging British power in India. So the building had to be larger and bigger than everything. And eventually, I think it's sort of around the 1920s, they had the last British resident in the area. The building was left pretty much to its own devices until the establishment of Osmania Women's College in sort of early 1950s. Universities notoriously in India have zero maintenance budget. They always have lots of money to build new buildings. And so this enormous 60-acre campus is full of new buildings, but over time, this lovely iconic building, which is the center of the campus, collapsed, and World Monuments came into play when, in fact, the roof fell in the entire western wing, and it came right through 3 floors. Large sections of the building, by the time we came into the project in about 2014, it was so far decayed that there were whole sections which were almost rebuilt, and the Darbar Hall, which Mimi Schmidt spoke about earlier, was even more tragic because its balconies had collapsed, the woodwork had rotted, and this is just complete lack of maintenance. And we realized very early on that the only way to secure the building in the future was to establish a project management committee from the start, which is chaired by the Vice Chancellor of the university. And it is true that these committees are successful as the person in the chair at the time. So over the course of 6 years, we've had some really successful partners, and there are times when it's really, you would be happy to have the next partner in play. But we make sure that as you restore the building, you create events, you raise an awareness, because within the campus, you need to draw people in from outside to see what's happening, to draw collaborations, and to bring people into the building to understand what you're doing. The idea is not just to take it back to where it was, but to make it a contemporary building. And so, evening with William Dalrymple and a famous singer, Vidya Shah, that brought alive the story of the residency, because it's a wonderful story of how the British resident fell in love with an Indian noblewoman and the notoriety attached to it. So that's very charming, and it keeps the stories alive, which is what one needs to do. But how do we make it relevant today? And hence, events like this, we found that the government was so impressed with the restoration that almost as soon as we'd done the facade and removed the scaffolding at the front, they had the police passing out parade. So it was interesting to see it coming into play, sometimes by design and sometimes by accident. There are virtual heritage walks, there are concerts, as you can see. I think our role here is not just to restore the building, but to bring it back to a living entity in the campus and in the city. And unless we're able to do that, you won't really be able to sustain the amount of work that's gone into it. And, you know, you have to justify how you're what its future life is. It's no longer nostalgic. It's here and now and interesting and contemporary, and there's stuff happening. Another very interesting palace we've been working on is in Lal Bagh. It's a palace in Indore. It's, as I was saying earlier, this whole strategy to entice the kings out of their forts. And this is an early 20th century classical European building. It's sort of really a fairly unpretentious building, which has been weathered very badly as it got taken over by the state and the princes left. And I think what, you know, there are these efforts by government of, oh, well, let's try and at least improve the frontage of the building. So they put a huge, spent a fortune putting concrete pavers, blocked all the drainage. And so when you go into starting work, when you talk to government, which has had to you have to justify why this vast amount of money they spent actually has to be undone because the rainwater is no longer draining away from it. So sometimes, you know, Rob was talking earlier about the importance of a conservation management plan. That is a critical document because even when World Monuments Fund leaves, you'll be able to have a basis on which future interventions can take place. And we have a very, very robust partnership with the state government to bring back a select number of rooms now into as how they were. I mean, quite clearly would not be possible to bring the entire palace back. Some of the rooms are beyond. We haven't had enough evidence. 1/3 of the building was not so much damaged in fire, but damaged with water dousing the fire. It's also such an interesting palace because you have a very classical Western dining room. I think it seats some 140 people, and you have an Indian dining room alongside. So, and the kitchens were across the river. So they're catered to this dual life that the kings lived. There was the European lifestyle with trompe l'oeil and gilding and fine dining, and a throne room, no longer a darbar hall. This is now a European throne room with huge amounts of work to be done. There's highly specialized craftsmen that are required to execute the work. Every inch of it is documented. So at any point, anyone can come in and see how, what work was done exactly where. And it has been a lot of fun bringing it back. I think one of the most challenging aspects has been the carpeting, where when we went into it, we didn't know whether we would rescue a single carpet. And out of the 6 rooms that we're going to complete, I think 5 rooms, we've rescued the carpeting. There's termite, the wool work had been completely worn away, the furnishing had been completely worn away. And we're slowly working, and it's a terrific experiment with also bringing in multiple craft skills from around the country to do this. The success of this, quite frankly, is going to be not when we hand over the building and walk away, but when you go back 5 years and you see whether your maintenance manual strategy you have given is actually being used, because you're going to say now you need high-tech equipment, you need maintenance itself is going to be a skilled activity. The other thing that seems to is now a challenge, and this is something you'll face, every project faces its own set of challenges and opportunities, is, okay, with the pandemic, there's now a money crunch. A lot of the work which was going to be funded by the state government through the Smart City program has got derailed, funding has got derailed, so the cultural center, which was going to generate money, which would plow back into the maintenance of the historic museum, of the historic house museum, may not be there. We don't know whether the 1/3 of the building will in fact work. So, and then we gave them plans to redevelop the gardens so that the gardens would become an active space for the community. That would be no longer, perhaps not a classical garden anymore, but a garden returned to the community. So they could use it for jogging in parks and playgrounds and so on for a certain amount of money, which would also plow back into maintenance. How do you buffer against this? The pandemic has laid us all vulnerable. We have no idea how we're going to be able to sustain all these. And so, you know, finally, you can have the finest plans. We looked at the establishment of a management framework. These are set up, as I said, at the very, very beginning of the project. You work very closely with whoever it is. In one case, it's the Madhya Pradesh government. You know, very, very senior officials lead these discussions because you want financial commitments. If you're going to put in X amount of effort and resources to restore a section of the building, you want to know that 2 years down the road, there is the capacity to sustain it. And so we build that in almost from the outset. There's continuous processes of dialogue. We are very, very particular that there are peer reviews of our restoration work so that we never are seen to be taking isolated decisions, but also that the stakeholders, and your principal stakeholder is always the owner of the building. So as a non-government agency that is coming into partnership with government or in the case of Osmania, the university, to restore the building, you need to have these relationships with the various stakeholders built in from the very beginning, because ultimately they are the final end users and they're the ones who will value, nurture, and protect the site. So for that's quite an exercise, because apart from the nationally protected monuments, the state protected or iconic buildings like a university campus, they don't have mechanisms for sustaining conservation work. So this takes quite a lot of effort to plow in at the beginning. So what are the challenges ahead? And as we look across a swath of historic sites in the country, how are we going to engage their future? And, you know, unfortunately, still in India, we often see conservation and restoration as an end in itself and not as a beginning. And the maintenance budgets don't exist. We can build a new building, but it's very hard to garner money or harness funds for maintenance, and it's a big challenge. I think the ones that have really been successful amongst the private houses in India are those that have been large enough and visionary enough to partner with hotels. So they get restored, they modernize, they are repurposed. There's a lot of modernization, but in fact, they are inaccessible to the general public. So you know, it's a very exclusive venture for a very exclusive clientele. I think what becomes much more real are the private trusts. These are viable heritage entities where they make their convert their forts more than their historic houses. So far in India, it's largely been forts, but one should look at historic houses for this, is they convert them into museums, into cultural centers. There's a business model, and there's a regular income from shops, there are cafeterias, and there's very, very high level of management, curatorial skills, and maintenance budgets. So I think there's a lot to be learned. Our projects are at the moment with government, but there's so much to be learned from how the private sector and private owners have stepped up in India and made their properties work for them. And they're really highly valued assets. And we really look to government to have a slightly more modern view while ensuring that we have access to all. And so government also has to walk this line, whether it's the Archaeological Survey of India or the state departments of archaeology. How do they ensure access? The other problems we face, for instance, is footfalls. None of these buildings are designed for footfalls. You have an vastly increased number of people, which brings its own maintenance challenges. And the minute you restore a building, the footfalls increase. And so, you have to build a future for that. And we also are in a constant dialogue is, where are the funds? I mean, you take even a site as large as the Taj Mahal, it has possibly the highest income of any site in India. And what they get for their maintenance is a pittance usually. It's enough, it's adequate, but rarely robust in comparison to what its entry fee is or what its gate takings are. So it's a disconnect, and one sort of continuously works, and I'm sort of a fairly strong advocate of this. So we need to look at new and viable ways government can ensure access, increase revenues through footfalls, given, in the post-pandemic era. But in the pandemic time, we need to look at how we can look at much better systems that would sustain these buildings, because we are, as you can see, we've done a lot of work at the Knesset Eliyahu Synagogue. How will this be maintained in 5 years? Will it be restored? Will it be maintained as it is? Will there be a temptation to say, oh, well, it's going to take a lot of effort to repaint it as has been done? That's a dialogue we need to keep going with. And overall, I think we have a great commitment to conservation. We need a much greater commitment to maintenance. And in all these historic sites, in my experience, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that from Antoine Wilmering, wall paintings remain the most vulnerable. I think they are the big story in the years ahead. But thank you so much, and thank you so much for letting me share a bit of our work with you.
Fantastic, Amita, and of course, highly, highly relevant. And we can also see, I think, from both presentations, how closely related the aspect of conservation is with the aspect of heritage management, of course. The Center for Historic Houses was primarily established with a purpose to find management plans for historic houses in India. And something we are developing now is non-visitor related business models, particularly during the pandemic, which is really interesting. And many of the ASI properties, you pay the entrance fee, but you cannot spend a single rupee on anything else. There is no cafe, there is no shop, nothing, right? So all of this infrastructure is often missing, but we will discuss that later. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to ask Austin next. Thank you very much. Austin is the head of conservation at the Courtauld Institute. Austin and I were actually students together in Oxford, so it's lovely to have this Oxford connection, and the whole week, of course, with the Center for Historic Houses participating in the Oxford University internship program. Thank you, Austin. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mimi. It's really great to see you again after such a long time. We've been writing, and now I'm here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Rob and Amita, for your really great talks about how to manage sites and how really difficult these questions are. And I'm really happy you cited wall paintings, Amita, at the end, because that's actually where the reason I came from Oxford to the Courtauld over 20 years ago, and I've just recently come back to London after a career in Europe, and I'm now the head of conservation at the Courtauld Institute of Art, which is this building here. I thought I would start here just telling you a little bit about the Courtauld, because we are one of the leading institutes for conservation education and art history in the UK and indeed in the world. And at the Courtauld, we not only teach conservation, but we are also a center for research and science. And behind this statue here, we also have a leading gallery, the Courtauld Gallery, of important Impressionist and other paintings. At the Courtauld, we teach easel painting conservation, which is a 3-year program, and we also teach wall painting conservation. And it is about the wall painting conservation that I'm going to be talking about today. And if I were not here speaking to you, I think my colleague Sibylla Tringham would be here giving this talk. She's now on maternity leave, but she is leading the wall painting conservation course, and I am now the head of department and speaking on behalf of the course about wall paintings. And you see Sibylla here treating paintings in the Nagaur fort using to try to reduce one of the biggest problems that we have when we face wall paintings, which is the influx of water and soluble salts. Soluble salts that we find everywhere from Dover Castle to the mountains in the Alps. Soluble salts, which if they crystallize on the surface of paintings, can destroy them in very little time. So I thought I would try to talk through some of the principles of conservation of wall paintings today, citing 2 examples from historic buildings, one of which I've worked in, the other one I haven't. And I'm going to start today with the Grand Master's Palace in Malta, in the capital of Malta, Valletta. Very important palace because this is where the leaders of the Knights of St. John would live. And this is the center now for the Maltese government. And within this palace, there are many wall paintings decorating the ceilings and decorating the rooms of the building. If you've ever been to Malta, you'll probably remember it as a fantastic and very, very small European country, which doesn't have its own supply of lime plaster. And so one of the big problems in Malta was the actual application of plasters made of lime to walls. And in fact, later in the 17th century and 18th century, many of the paintings in Malta were done with oil on stone. But instead, these paintings here by Perez de Lecho are painted in fresco. And they are in relatively good condition, although they are now being conserved after many years of neglect. Instead, I'm going to talk about a project that the Courtauld was involved in another room in the same palace of the Grand Masters. Now, if you are aware of remember your history, in the 1940s, there was a great siege of Malta, and Malta was heavily bombed. And the bombing in Malta caused the massive detachment of the wall painting surface, the plaster, from the stone support. And one of the paintings in the Grand Master's Palace was seriously damaged during the bombing in 1942, sorry. And for 60 years, these paintings were covered in these lottery tickets that were applied at the time using flour paste to face the surface and protect the painting from falling off the wall. And as I think Amita mentioned, one of the biggest risks that we have is that the paintings will actually fall off. They will be gone. That will be it. They're very vulnerable to maintenance problems. Now, fortunately, the building of the Grand Master's Palace, the roof was fine. It was maintained, but instead, these lottery tickets remained on the surface of the painting because nobody knew what to do, how to remove them, and how to stabilize the wall painting. And normally, when we talk about the best way of preservation is prevention. The best way of conservation is maintenance. But what if we don't have a solution and how to treat these paintings? What should we do? Who are the doctors? Who are the conservators we should turn to? Well, the Maltese government asked experts from around the world, and we're told that the only thing that could be done would be to rip the paintings off the wall, put them somewhere else. That wasn't a solution that we were very happy with at the Courtauld. And instead, when we arrived at the to examine the paintings, having been experts were called and examined the paintings and tried to figure out what could be done, the first thing that we need to do was to document the condition of the paintings, to try to document exactly what is happening. And here you can see a raking light image Very large paintings, these are. Very large paintings, and you can see how rough the surface is of these paintings. And you can also see, I think in the middle of this screen, if I turn on my pointer, you can see here the stone underneath where there's been loss of the paintings themselves. Big pieces of plaster have fallen off. Study of the paintings revealed the fact that much of the paintings were actually hiding voids. They were voids of empty spaces beneath the painted surface. Some of the voids were very large indeed, if you consider that this wall painting is probably, this is 1 meter here. So we're talking about 8 meters by 5 meters, more or less. And this is one of the scenes, but the chapel is filled with wall paintings, with many voids. And one of the problems with voids is not that they exist, but in this case, they are contiguous voids. So very large areas of plaster were actually not detached from the wall. And close examination of the plaster revealed that this plaster was very thin, 1 or 2 millimeters thick. There's a big risk that in removing those lottery tickets, the plaster would actually fall off the wall. 50% of the 120 square meters of wall painting was separated from the wall. That's what we estimated at the time. And in some areas, the detachment from the wall was not small. It wasn't 1 millimeter or 2 or 3, but it was almost up to 4 millimeters. That's a huge amount for a very thin plaster. And those lottery tickets had held the plaster in place for 60 years. But if you can imagine what an old Agatha Christie looks like, a 60-year-old book, perhaps slightly damp some of the year, paper is not very strong in those conditions. And there was a big risk that the paper would actually, was also cracking. You can see cracks here coming through. And the big question was, well, how can we address this? If we're not going to take the paintings off the wall, which would be very difficult and destructive anyway, can we try to re-adhere them to the stone? And one of the problems is that you can buy glue, you can buy all kinds of glues and materials, cements and so on and so forth. However, those materials are not very compatible with the original materials. And I remember Rob mentioned like for like. And like for like isn't very easy in this situation. We don't have a like plaster to stick the 1 millimeter plaster back on the wall with a 4 centimeter void. So instead, conservators at the Courtauld here, we have Stephen Rickaby and Lisa Cicada worked on the development of new materials, innovative materials which would satisfy the performance characteristics needed to treat these paintings, to allow the careful and sustainable re-adhesion of the plaster to the stone support, not trying to fill all the voids, but trying to create a stable surface. And that required a great deal of research so that the injection grouting that was done here, which is one of the most difficult interventions in wall painting conservation, could be carried out. And this took many years, 3 or 4 years of conservation treatments to in sequential steps to stabilize the paintings. The good thing though, is that this painting, since it was finished, has not needed to be treated at all. Here we can see the removal after the stabilization of the plasters, the gradual removal of the lottery tickets. And here you can see the date, 9th of October, 1943. They lasted 60 years and they were removed. And underneath, we have a very beautiful and well conserved painting. And because they were not removed, these paintings still, they're in very good condition in the Grand Master's Palace in Valletta, and they are visible to all those who go and visit the Grand Master's Palace itself. And the reason I showed you this example was really to highlight how difficult it is to treat. There's no one-size-fits-all treatment. Indeed, conservation of wall paintings often relies on innovative new solutions that we find on an almost case-by-case The next And second example I thought I would share with you today comes from the Achhicharagarh Fort and Palace Complex in Nagaur in Rajasthan, where the court holders have been working since 2005. And under the direction of the Maharaj Museum Trust and His Highness Maharaja Gai Singh II, this has been the subject of major conservation interventions. And indeed, the court order arrived at Nagaur after the architectural conservation had already taken place, the maintenance of the building, which is a very, very important step. So here we see the Hani Rani Mahal and other buildings in Nagaur, which are very beautiful from the outside, but in the inside of these buildings, they're decorated with fantastic wall paintings. One of the big problems that we have in outdoor climates like this is the accumulation of dust. Accumulation of dust and the types of climate change that we heard about later, dust storms and cycles of pollution can cause massive problems to wall paintings, because wall paintings are the interface between the building and the outside world. And in this case, we see an example of the careful application of a cleaning method for the gradual removal of the dust and dirt which is accumulated on the surface. When considering wall paintings and wall painting conservation, one of the first steps is the mapping of the condition, trying to understand in a similar way to the management plans that we saw earlier with Rob, but on a very much finer detail, the types of conditions that we will find, for example, here in the Sheesh Mahal North Vault wall paintings. We see areas of detachment. We see areas of severe detachment, some cracking, for example. Other areas where there's flaking, micro flaking, and also the big baddies that I mentioned earlier, the soluble salts. Salts which might be thin or might be very thick. And I think what you understand from this map that I show you here is that there's not one simple, easy solution to these wall paintings. There are many different things happening at the same time. And therefore, condition assessment, where we carefully map the current condition of a painting, is very important when we, in terms of defining the different methods we would try to adopt in addressing each one of the degradation factors. Here is an example of the beautiful paintings that we can see with our eyes. But if we use scientific methods like UV-induced luminescence, we can see instead the hidden details that are no longer available, that are no longer visible. Indeed, if I'll go back a moment, the organic yellow pigments that you can see bright yellow in this image have faded. And the cloud-like structure that we can see in the background is also very difficult to see in the visible light. And this technique gives us an insight into the way the paintings once looked, but they no longer look today. And on the left-hand side, we can see the salt efflorescence, the salt appearing on the surface of this painting. It's really difficult to know how to remove them because we can't use water to remove them. And if we remove them, will they come back or not? And on the right-hand side, we can see some testing in the field. Very important aspect of wall painting conservation is the possibility that we can do rapid tests in the field using relatively inexpensive methods to identify, for example, what type of salts do we have? Is it sodium chloride, or is it potassium nitrate, or is it calcium sulfate, or is it something else that we have on this surface? Here's another example of the beautiful wall paintings within the complex. And we can see here, the reason I wanted to show you this is something that's happened to the lead pigments. Conservation is often about mitigating or accepting change. And one of the changes that we often find with the pigments that we see in wall paintings is inevitable chemical degradation. And here we have an example of lead white and red lead. Beautiful pigments, but they're not very stable. And they tend to degrade and oxidize to darker mineral, platinumite, which is a black color. We can't reverse this. This has happened. This is the original material. but it's no longer the original color. On the right-hand side, instead, we see the ink work which was used to paint this, this woman's face. And here we see another example of the thinning of a treatment that was applied in the past, but which actually caused significant change to the surface. Best efforts in the past to conserve these wall paintings and to stabilize the flaking surfaces were applied using what was believed to be the best adhesive, PVA. But PVA reacts, PVA yellows, and PVA also creates other acetate salts. And so careful and selective cleaning of the background in this figure succeeded in creating a much more homogeneous effect and to remove that yellowing, disfiguring yellowing. But it also highlighted how difficult it is for us because we don't, as I said, have the magic solution of all the right materials, but we do have ways of trying to test the compatibility of materials and the suitability of those materials in different contexts and climates. In situ investigations like these for the examination of the surface of the paintings are critical because what I can see with my eyes, I know is not what you see with yours. And moreover, conservation is about an effort to document the condition of the surface so that we can come back, for example, next year and check to see if that surface has changed or not. And here we can see a relatively inexpensive portable microscope for the examination of the condition of the surface of the wall paintings. And here we see the way the paintings look after treatment. They're legible, they're stable. And that is what we want to achieve in trying to conserve wall paintings, to make them stable. Not to restore them to some idea of former glory, not to paint them or overpaint them with modern pigments, which might make them look a bit different, but instead to respect the original and to restore stability so that they will last a lot longer. And in the face of climate change that Rob mentioned, we recognize that as a major risk. And the footfall is another major risk. But do you know what the biggest risk is for wall paintings, in my view? People like me, conservators, who might come along and decide that what they really need is a nice coat of varnish, or what they really need is some new fancy material, some composite material which will make them shiny again. Because I don't know how we will remove that in the future. And the costs related to conservation are often very, very large. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. But what we do produce in conservation projects is a great deal of data, a great deal of new insights into the way materials behave, and we also develop methods so that we are able better to stabilize and treat paintings in other places in the future. Now, I'd like to close today with a bit of an advert for the conservation programs at the Courtauld, because in 2022, we'll be opening the wall painting conservation project the conservation of wall painting master's degree again. We also have in 2022, a master's in the conservation of Buddhist art. And I invite you to contact me and look on our website for both these programs, and write to me, please, if you're interested in coming to London to learn conservation of wall paintings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Austin. I'm really absolutely amazed. I mean, the work is so fantastic and so sensitive. And as you say, because we see a lot of really fake kind of color schemes and so on, it's really just amazing, really inspirational. Thank you so much. We are now coming to our last speaker, Antoine Wilmering from the Getty, who's done really fantastic work in the past and as a conservator as well of furniture. And he's going to talk to us about something different that we haven't had today yet, namely modern architecture and his program at the Getty. So I'd like to welcome you very warmly, Antoine.
Thank you, Mimi. I'm going to start with sharing my screen like everybody else has. But that's always causing me a challenge, so I'm going to try it again. Here we go. Almost there. Here we go. How's this?
Yes.
Good. Mimi, thank you so much. And Rob, Amita, and Austin, thank you for your presentations as well. And thank you to the Center for Historic Houses. As you say, I'm a senior program officer at the Getty Foundation. And I'm going to talk briefly about the Getty itself, and then I will focus on an initiative that we have had for the last 7 years, which is called Keeping It Modern. So the Getty is a non-governmental organization, so we're independent of the government, and we focus on the visual arts. And in the visual arts, we support and we value art historical research, so academic research, research into the preservation of works of art and architecture, and we support a museum. And then I belong to the Getty Foundation, so one of 4 programs where we support the field in the areas where the Getty is active. So again, in academic research, in conservation, and in museums. We are fully committed to work internationally. So our colleagues have projects where they are actively engaged on the ground all over the world. And us as a funder, we support projects around the world, but we don't really get actively involved ourselves. Now, in 2013, in 2012, our colleagues at the Getty Conservation Institute, they launched a new initiative called the Modern Architecture or Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative. And that focused on the idea that modern architecture is so recent to our past that sometimes we skip a research phase and we just go straight into doing maintenance work or restoration work without really understanding the intrinsic value and significance of what modern architecture represents. And because our colleagues had started this initiative, we were in discussion with them and thinking, well, is there a way that we can draw attention to this important issue through grant making? And can we broaden the scope of raising awareness about the issues related to modern architecture? And so we developed this initiative, a 7-year initiative, as I mentioned, called Keeping It Modern. Now, the foundation is not a stranger to architecture conservation grants, and we've given grants in this field before, and those included buildings like the Crown Hall by Mies van der Rohe, or even Shackleton's hut in the Antarctic, and I'll show images in a moment. Our main goal for Keeping It Modern was to advance the conservation and stewardship of 20th century architecture. That's a big, lofty goal, and I will explain in my talk how we came about to achieve this, we think, and what strategies we had in place. Here is the Crown Hall and Shackleton's hut, 20th century buildings for which we have given grants before. But with the Keeping It Modern, we really sort of step back and say, why do we support modern architecture? What are the issues of modern architecture? Clearly, there was a building boom in the 20th century, so structures were built rapidly. Economies were growing, post-war optimism, so buildings were erected quickly. There were new building systems developed, new materials developed, some of which were not thoroughly tested, and all that combined sort of created new conservation challenges that the field has to face today. Apart from the challenges of new materials and novel designs and proposing challenges that are different from traditional architecture, there's also a threat of demolition. And demolition, of course, is mostly driven by financial gain, where, you can see here with Prentice Hall that, the space around Prentice Hall and in Chicago and the space above it is tremendously valuable. And so because of financial gain, the Prentice Hall was sacrificed, which is very unfortunate. It's a beautiful building. Modern architecture is neglected. Here's a fantastic example of Marcel Breuer's Ariston Club building in Argentina, in Mar del Plata. Totally abandoned today. And as we've heard before from Rob and Austin, climate change, and Amita pointed to that as well, climate change and the accompanying extreme weather events cause problems for buildings that when they were created, the issues were not there that there are today. And an example here is this the Viking Ship Museum by Sørensen that was completed in 1968. It received a historic listing, the highest listing in Denmark in 1998. And then several storm surges that began in 2013 caused high water and caused the museum to flood. And originally it was intended to evoke this closeness to the sea and have the Viking ships sort of in direct dialogue with the water. But it was not anticipated that the galleries would actually flood. And now their government is looking at, they have already delisted the building, and they're looking at taking the building down and building a new structure that provides greater protection. Now, the Getty is not alone in having and in their desire to raise awareness about the conservation of modern architecture. There is ICOMOS has a 20th century scientific committee. There is DOCOMOMO, a large international organization, and then the different country chapters have also created their own charters and guides for preserving modern architecture. So there's the Madrid document, the Burra Charter. And then the Getty Conservation Institute is working on creating resources for the preservation of modern architecture. So in our funding initiative, we looked at the different strategies that we could envision that would help advance the practice of conservation for modern architecture. And we thought that an important strategy would be to support research and analysis, or creating planning documents, and more precisely conservation management planning documents for modern buildings. We supported a few implementation grants to show how once you develop a conservation plan, how implementation can then sustain a building. We convened grantees and key consultants on the projects. We brought each year after we've awarded a round of grants, we brought the specialists to London and talked about conservation planning for 3 or 4 days. Did site visits to the National Theatre, to the Royal College of Physicians, to the Barbican Center, to see conservation management plans being used and how they've helped with sustain those buildings. And so those grantee convenings were actually a very effective and very powerful strategy that also created lasting networks among professionals. And then lastly, we had this strategy that we wanted to share outcomes with the field. So we created a conservation report library where, and I'll share the link later on, where you can see and where you can download conservation reports that came out some of our planning projects. Here are a few examples of 77 projects that we've supported to date. Max Berg's Centennial Hall, the Luce Chapel by IMP, Sydney Opera House, of course, such an iconic building, Pierre Génére's Gandhi Bhagwan at Punjab University. But because of the theme of this week's lectures, I wanted to focus on several projects from the 1920s. And on this slide, it's Einstein Tower, the Richfeld House, and Melnikov House. And these are modern historic houses. Well, except Einstein Tower, which is a solar observatory. And it was built as a solar observatory and is still used as such today. But you will see here in a time span of 1 decade, 3 highly innovative structures with, you know, sort of showing this incredible post-war optimism, this sort of burst of creation. And with that comes, of course, a myriad of conservation challenges. Starting with the Richfeld House, which is, you can see a little bit here, it's at the end of blocks of row houses, traditional Dutch brick row houses, but completely new and completely innovative furniture maker, Gerrit Richfeld, designed this house for a widow, Schroeder, and she wanted something unique, and he created something unique, as you can see. Now, this museum, this building is a World Heritage Site. It is constructed of large concrete slabs intersected with steel and glass, and it is operated and it belongs to the custody and stewardship of the Central Museum in Utrecht. So it belongs to a museum, but it is operated as an independent site. Here you can see some earlier photographs on the left, and on the right, actually, you get a better view of how the building sort of ends a block of row houses. And in developing the conservation plan, the project team, they felt very strongly that not only would they have to look at all the design drawings and the as-built drawings, but they also had to look at how has this building performed over time? What were some of the past restorations? What was still authentic? What needed to be or might have to be restored? And then how do you maintain this building going forward? So what is the maintenance plan or maintenance schedules that you will have to develop for a building like this? As part of their effort, they consulted extensively with Bertus Mulder. You see him on the left here, on the upper left corner. And he was a close collaborator of Richfeld. And he actually was the first person who restored this building, which took place in the 1970s. So he was a valuable resource for the project team. And I think that's an important aspect actually of conservation management planning when you go through the process, that you actually engage people who have knowledge of the house. So either through oral histories or even people who live in the community. So community engagement or community events are really important for developing and writing a conservation management plan. And I think that goes to what Rob was saying earlier, that if you have a building that is sort of not so looked after or is a little bit out of the mainstream access-wise, then it's more vulnerable to youth gathering, to vandalism, to graffiti spraying. But when you engage the community, when you're they feel some sort of ownership for this house in this case, but for other structures, then you mitigate in a very powerful way the chance of vandalism. Here are some interior shots of the Richfeld house, and what you may not see, but if you look in the roof at the ceiling, I mean, you'll see some tracks there. And what is interesting about this house that it was modular on the inside. So there were walls that could be moved, and so you could create more private spaces. So you can see here is someone just moving a wall either in or out. In the same decade, Eric Mendelssohn designed this beautiful tower. It's called the Einstein Tower, but it's a solar observatory. And in addition to a conservation management plan, the investigators on this project had to look at also sustainability. And they were looking at how can they create an indoor environment for the tower that is sustainable, so that doesn't cost a lot of energy. And they came up with a very interesting plan, or actually here's the detail of the solar scope. And I find it interesting, so this building dates to 1921, but it's still used as a solar observatory, so it still functions after 100 years. That's quite amazing. It has a large underground section. That is what I wanted to show. And that is now where many computers are housed. And they have devised a system in the tower to garner some of the computer energy and then warm up the tower itself. So they have created a sustainability plan that is really effective and helps them with cost savings. Their plan is available in the Keeping in Modern report library. So you can, at your leisure, download it and have a look at what they developed. Also in the same decade, a house that is one of my favorites. And of course, as a grant maker, and when you have 70 projects, you're not supposed to have a favorite. It's like when you have a family with 6 kids and one asks, who's your favorite? But in this case, I'm not shy about saying that this is one of my favorite projects. And the background that you see behind me is actually not my house. It is one of the floors in Melnikov House. It's built as 2 cylinders. So actually here you see the front of the house, and you see the light coming in on the right side of the slide, and on the left you see the front. And if I go back, this is the back of the house. And it's just a wonderful open glass facade, 2 intersecting circles that are co-joined, and in a beautiful spot in Moscow. Now it's surrounded by, urban developments or urban encroachment. But as a historic house, this is an amazing resource. They created a conservation management plan, and when they did, the house actually moved under stewardship of the State Architecture Museum in Moscow. So they have actually very good custodianship, and they have already worked on the garden and on the geology, because there were issues with the foundation. And now they're developing a further plan for the interiors and the collections. And it was Melnikov who lived there himself. So he was an architect. And then his son lived there, who was a painter. So it has, and then the son had 2 daughters. So there are 3 generations that lived in the house. and there were some changes, but in large part, it has been preserved very well. And as a building, as a historic house of the 20th century, this is one of the most unique examples of the 1920s that I can think of. Yet completely different from the Richfeld house, what is so like Richfeld's furniture, so rectangular and so and modular at the same time. And this has a completely different shape and different philosophy. Also of the, just a year after the decade of the 20s, Le Corbusier built the Molitor building in France, and he occupied the two upper floors in the building. So he had one, his apartment there, and he had his atelier, his painting studio there. And here you see Le Corbusier. He was a well-known painter, and of course, he's a world-famous architect. Le Corbusier had very strong opinions about art and architecture. I think everybody knows that, and he was very influential. And he was very successful and had a nice little cabin in France, where there was a sort of how can you say that, a conglomerate of smaller houses of artists that lived there. And one is the Villa E1027, built and designed by Eileen Gray. And she designed this house as a getaway, as a retreat for herself and her lover, Jean Baldovici. And their relation didn't last long, so already in the 1930s, they had broken up, and Eileen Gray didn't live there so much anymore. And it was like a summer vacation house. But you can see the interior design where she put large color fields and very minimalistic. So she designed her own furniture, and she's well known for that. But the interior is very simple, very nicely laid out. And this was her preference. This is her design. But Le Corbusier, who lived next door during his vacations, was a friend of Baldovici. And at some point, after Eileen Gray didn't live there anymore, he took it up on himself to paint some of the walls. And this is, these are these large white walls that Eileen Gray valued. So I'll go back here, or she valued these white spans, or, beautiful blue coverings. But Corbusier, just totally not respecting that, came in and painted his paintings. So this is the Eileen Gray vision. And this is one angle that shows Le Corbusier's work. And he did, I think, maybe 5 or maybe up to 7 paintings where he felt, that was his right. And he did this without approval of Eileen Gray. So this has been a controversy since the 1930s and 1940s. And in the current work that the organization has done at the Cap Moderne for this building, they created not only a conservation plan, but they also developed a philosophy about how can you balance the vision of Eileen Gray with the unfortunate intervention of Le Corbusier. But Le Corbusier is important enough as an architect and artist not to erase his work. So how do you then balance Le Corbusier's intervention and his artistic contribution to Eileen's purer vision, knowing that Eileen Gray just absolutely abhorred the work that Le Corbusier had done? So they looked at several options, and I think they finally arrived at the solution that they have very thin white panels that on certain days they can put in front of the wall paintings as to obscure them. And you see that in this picture, where it will appear as if you're looking at a white wall, but in fact it is a white screen that sits close to the wall painting and obscures it. And I think it's probably a very elegant solution, because it will allow you to show history and show the significant intervention in the house that's become part of the house, but also it allows you to take visitors back to explore and appreciate the pure vision of Eileen Gray. Here are some other examples. So these are the examples that I gave from the 1920s are just a few of the projects that we supported through Keeping It Modern. And here at this slide, you see in the bottom the link to our report library. And when you can visit that, you can download for free the conservation plans that are presented there. And since the initiative is ongoing, we will be adding more reports to the library. So it will serve as a resource to the field. And there are several reports in there that relate to historic houses. So they might, my feeling is they will be of interest to you. And this is my last slide, and I thank you for your attention.
Absolutely fantastic and so funny, this Gray and Le Corbusier argument and so on. I didn't know about this. Really fascinating. I'm sure all of us will be very interested in reading this report. So maybe the internet can just help me to get this report, this link, so I can share this the attendance and also share it on social media, because the Getty resources are really fantastic resources. So are English heritage resources that I've actually shared with our audience in India, and many of them have been really grateful for these, even although they were in a different context. But as you know, in India we also have the serious problem with water and the salts, not only in wall paintings but in general, with such an extreme climate in the monsoon. So this remains some of our most serious challenges, and I haven't found a solution for it yet. So I'm really interested in the kind of cutting edge research. I hear that there's someone at Cambridge working specifically on this problem. So I keep my eyes open for this. So this has been absolutely fascinating. I'd like to address a few questions. Archie, first of all, question for Rob and other speakers who are interested. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I was particularly interested in the practical ways in which buildings are assessed and graded for conservation. And you mentioned also the significance earlier. So I also wanted to ask you what makes it significant and how do you actually give the marks, so to say? And I hadn't thought about the realities of that before. How do you go about awarding a building significance? Do you reach out to communities with surveys? How do you do that?
Well, our approach to significance is based on the English heritage guidance on values, which was, I can't remember the date of it now, but it was one of those that was set up before the split between English heritage and historic England. But it's still extremely valid because it asks questions about the evidential value, aesthetic value, community value, and others. And it's just enough to be able to prompt thought into why places actually matter. And assessing significance is, it's an art, essentially. It's about discussion, it's about insight, it's about research, it's about professional knowledge. And the way we do it is in English heritage, because we rely on the knowledge and expertise of our property curators, who are archaeologists and building historians. And we have another team of historians who look into the development of properties. And they're able to advise and just their knowledge and say, well, this aspect, this wing of the building is the earliest aspect, the earliest bit of construction. So we know that that's extremely important. I'm working with our curators on a site in Lincoln where we've got degrading stonework, where you might look at it and go, well, there's not much there now, but our property curator, our head property curator, is absolutely adamant. This is one of the most significant pieces of early medieval carving, therefore it's of such significance we have to find the best ways of conserving it, probably through some sort of intervention, as I've described before. So there's a combination of a lot of those things. So we are acknowledging, you know, we're taking an expert approach, but of course that is not the only way of doing it. And of course, when we look outside of English heritage properties and look beyond our own mindset, we recognize that people have got lots of different views.
Mm.
And we've had some real challenges recently where we've been planning projects and development some of our properties, which arguably are you know, not ours, they're the communities, they're in the public realm. You know, there's no gates to stop people coming in and out. They're very much part of townscapes and urban areas where our views have been strongly challenged by people. And rightly so, because, you know, the communities who love and care for these places and want to use them have very, very strong views. So we've definitely taken a view now to make a much more inclusive approach, listening to people's views when it comes to big projects. So there's no hard and fast rules to it, but it is professional judgment. How we've applied it at the end of the day in our conservation frameworks is that best judgment just to define which parts of the property we really want to you know, give the most attention to. And actually, to be honest with you, it's very challenging because so many of our properties are hugely significant. And one of our speakers said, how do you decide between your children? You can't. You have to make a very informed professional view.
I think this would be potentially really interesting for a kind of collaborative approach from various countries. I mean, I'm not sure whether you know the fantastic study of the European Historic Houses Association on impact of historic houses for communities and assessing this. And they have a list of a number of parameters. And I'm trying to actually create such a catalog for the Indian properties, also in finding appropriate management schemes. For instance, you know, one house might be near the sea, one might be in the hills, one might be in the city center, and all of these require totally different approaches. So if I want to find management schemes, I cannot use one for all, but I have to assess it individually, but I can't do it for 70,000 buildings. So I have to, you know, find kind of, you know, tools to do this and strategies. So I think this would be really interesting in listening to some of the private historic houses associations and, you know, it's institutions such as yours to find, you know, come up with some good tools and evaluation schemes and solutions. And I was, you know, when I saw this, you know, the Roman villa, I immediately thought of Carnuntum, because sometimes if you have nothing there, it can be one of the most exciting places to visit. I mean, I don't know whether you've heard of Carnuntum outside of Vienna. It is such a popular and really amazing destination of just one part of a Roman villa, but then they kind of established a visitor center and lots of activities for children, learning, you know, how to make recipes from Roman times, and a chariot race actually that children can participate in, and lots of games. It's so exciting. And, you know, I wouldn't have assumed, you know, that this could be done, because normally I think you need the house, the roof, you know, all of the rooms, the furniture, but it's not necessary. The success, the importance for the community is not dependent on the roof of the structure. So how would you assess this kind of significance for the communities when you have something like Stonehenge? And I think so much money was invested in this visitor center, and, you know, but then it didn't immediately result in more visitors necessarily, and so on. So how do you actually look at the significance from a community point of view?
I think there's, I mean, you're right. You don't need a roof to allow people's imagination to run wild. I mean, we've got lots of properties in English heritage which are roofless ruins. There's stone monuments, stone circles. They're wonderful places like Grimes Graves, which is a Neolithic stone quarry, where the exciting thing is to actually go down into the quarry itself and see where people took out flints, which actually turned into tools, and that whole understanding of you know, very early communities absolutely resonates, particularly with school children, particularly with you know, people who love to be inspired by ideas and creativity. So I think there's lots you can do on a property that doesn't necessarily need to be defined by, you know, the standard approaches. And we're going to be running a project in probably next year, which is looking at Richfeld Roman Fort, which is where the Romans originally came to Britain. It's the gateway to Roman Britain, where we're going to be building a gateway, new gateway, actually in the site itself, on the site of where the original gateway for the fort was. So you have this whole wonderful reinvention of what it would have been like to approach this fort, what it would be like to actually stand above the ruins, which are quite hard to interpret when you're just wandering around them. But actually looking down on them will really bring it to life. And of course, through that, we're talking to local groups and local stakeholders who've got a strong interest in what we're doing, to make sure that we're you know, learning from their interests. And we've done a lot of that recently in Bristol, with that church that I mentioned, because it's, again, it's not ours in the sense of, you know, we're responsible for it, accountable, but it's part of the community, and the community want to see a new future for it. So we're trying to facilitate what they're looking for, not just dictate.
Right, so there's a question, thank you, from Ayushi, for everyone. Thank you so much for your inspiring insights. I have a question for all the speakers. Conservation is driven by the human desire to save, preserve, and conserve as much as we can. But Rob, as you outlined, climate change is a serious concern, eclipsing our horizons. In light of these concerns, how much can we really conserve? Is it actually a good and sustainable idea to conserve as much as we can? How do you decide what should be conserved and what should not? Could you perhaps discuss a time when you decided to not conserve a painting or property heritage site?
Would you like me to have a go with that, or pass on to another one of the speakers?
Why don't you just comment quickly and then we pass it on to the others?
Okay, well, I'll come first. I mean, firstly, I think that we've got to recognise with climate change that, I mean, it's a change that will impact our working lives and our businesses and our landscapes and ecology and the rest of it. But we've got to look at what matters. So this comes back to significance. We value places; they're important in times of change. So I think anything's told us certainly through COVID and lockdown, or through times of you know, catastrophic events, people look to culture, they look to their history, look to heritage. So I think in a way we will want we'll have a desire to look after places no matter the challenges we face. I think there's a very human nature. I think the challenge in looking after all the sites in our care is recognizing that the environment we're working in is changing. So what do we do? And I always believe our first principle, and this is really to Amita's point, is maintenance. You know, if we're not maintaining our properties properly, if we're not actually giving the due care or attention on a little and often day-to-day basis and understanding the processes of change, then we're nowhere. So the important thing is think of core maintenance as the front line. So we like to talk about adaptation or mitigation, all these other things, and building resilience. Maintain your properties.
Right, and you also mentioned thermal comfort in a way, which is different from the 21st, you know, in the 21st century in comparison to other centuries, and we can't really adapt this so easily. Maybe Austin, you could also try to answer this question that Ayushi was asking.
Yeah, I would say that there are so many ways that we can understand what climate change means and the impact that it will have on our heritage. And they're not direct always, it's not always obvious, but as people move into the cities because they have no more water in the countryside, that has a massive impact on the heritage we have in cities and the access to heritage elsewhere. So it's very complicated, and I think that my attitude or my response to this would be that we need to understand the role of the environment within sites and within buildings. And it's not straightforward. There are no magic numbers that I have at my fingertips to tell you what the right environment is, unless I observe and I record. And so observing and recording the environment and monitoring the environment to determine whether or not, for example, you have mold growth in your building, or if you have salt coming out of the walls, or if your slight heating will actually really improve or not. Those are questions that I can't answer unless I actually check. But you asked, what about when we don't conserve? And I would say that the best thing to do is not touch anything until you understand what if there are reasons, if there are actually changes. Oftentimes people say, look, this painting's very damaged and degraded. And I say, okay, well, let's come, monitor it and see what's happening. And if next year it looks the same, then we'll do the same. We'll wait. We don't have to wait for it to get damaged. But I think that cautious non-intervention is much more powerful than quick decision-making because we want to fix something up. But at the same time, I absolutely agree with Rob. Maintenance and maintenance of the envelope is fundamental, because the catastrophic disasters that will occur if maintenance doesn't occur. We've seen this in Mali, and how important the maintenance of the earthen structures are every year, because if they're not maintained, when the rain comes, they will be washed away. And so maintenance and involvement with communities to ensure that maintenance is built into the management plan. So the roofs are maintained, so the drains are cleaned, so that the waterways are there in the right place, so that that growth doesn't occur around buildings and cause greater fire risk. These are kind of basic ideas, but they're not. And therefore, I think that maintenance is so much more important than intervention.
So this brings me to another question, namely, on the one hand, respecting local materials, local traditions. On the other hand, reaching out to new technologies. Rob, you also mentioned the case with the roof, the waterproofing of the roof and so on. So to what extent in the maintenance do you consider these kind of modern technologies or modern materials to assure that the buildings are safe?
I think I'll give the example of what we're doing at Kenwood House in North London, where we're working in partnership with Ecclesiastical Insurance, who are a big insurer of historic buildings and schools and other institutes around the country, and a firm called Shepherd FM, who are tech developers. So they're the brains behind all this. What we're working with there is working on testing how buildings perform. Now, we're already tracking our environmental performance, temperature, relative humidity, to understand the conditions for the interior of the building. What we wanted to understand was could we use the data coming through to test our energy use, the use of where in the building was energy used, where are the risks in terms of peaks and flows for power, and what are the can we capture what's happening in terms of fire risk, compliance, security? So basically trying to digitize the whole property. And that's good. We've got a series of sensors all over the building, which is recording activity on a 24-hour basis, and that's starting to build a set of patterns. And what's happening is the system is learning what good looks like, and we can define what good looks like. And when you see the deviation from what that looks like, then you realize even before there's an issue, you're going to have to address it. So it'll know if you're going to have a water leak, for example, and a water leak in a historic building can be disastrous for your collection and your interiors. It'll know before you need to know that you've got spikes in electric use. So you can get onto trying to resolve the problem in a much more predictive way than you can do than if you go then the phone goes and you've got to get people to sort it out. So it's a good example of how you can use tech to start thinking about your maintenance in a completely different way. We've got loads to learn from this yet. It's early days, but it's really exciting to see how it's set up. And the guys from Ecclesiastical has said that Kenwood is now as digitally connected as the Shard.
I was also thinking of some insulation material, because especially, you know, a lot of the heat radiation comes from the roof. In India, we are dealing with, we're trying to find natural ways to cool down buildings and so on. And I've looked at some German materials that you can use to put on the roof to have an insulation to either cool it or you know, or make it warmer in the winter. So have you ever worked with something like this, to materials to put on the roofs?
Not directly on the roofs, no. I mean, insulation in buildings is really important, particularly in the UK environment. But
we have flat roofs, of course, in India. That's slightly different. Yeah.
Yeah, and we haven't. We're using fairly conventional approaches, admittedly, in terms of insulation. Back in my National Trust days, we did try and use hardwick wool. You know, lovely sustainable story. You've taken the wool from the sheep up on the fells and the Lake District and turning it into a new product for a new market. But it turned out not to be the best solution after all, because actually there were lice and insects actually within the wool itself, which then actually creates its own problem with a historic building. But that's learning. We've got to learn from these things. We've got to be able to experiment and see what works. So I think, you know, we're going to keep on looking for new solutions to reduce our energy. But at the moment, our focus is on actually some of my heating systems in English heritage properties are almost as old as the properties themselves. They're not even worth the museum pieces. They're trying to move.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. This was a real luxury for us to just spend 2 hours listening to these fantastic presentations about various adaptations, issues, and of historic buildings in different parts of the world. Thank you so much. Please stay in touch, and I'd really love to follow up. And especially now that I know what your interests are and so on, I'd like to put you in touch with some other people who are working in similar fields. As I said, the water and heritage particularly would be great. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.